The year is 1940. The war in Europe is not a war of equals. It is a blitzkrieg, a storm of steel and fire unleashed by the Nazi war machine. And at the heart of this storm is the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. And at the heart of the Luftwaffe sits Hermann Göring, Reichsmarshal, successor designate to Hitler himself. A man swollen with power, encrusted with medals of his own design, basking in the invincible glow of his aerial armada. In his headquarters, the air is thick with the smell of fine cigars and the intoxicating scent of unchallenged supremacy. His Stuka dive bombers have become the screaming heralds of terror. His Messerschmitt fighters have cleared the skies of all challengers. Poland, then France, had crumpled under the weight of his aircraft. To the world, the Luftwaffe is not just a military force. It is an instrument of destiny, and then a message filters through from across the Atlantic. A voice, calm yet resolute, crackles over radio waves, finding its way into Göring's opulent court. It is the voice of Franklin D. Roosevelt. The American president speaks to a nation not yet at war, but a nation stirring. He makes a promise. A pledge so audacious, so seemingly disconnected from reality, that it borders on the absurd. The United States, he declares, will become the great arsenal of democracy, and to do this, it will achieve the impossible. It will build 50,000 military aircraft in a single year. The courtiers in the room hold their breath, waiting for the Reichsmarshal's reaction. It begins as a low rumble in his chest, then erupts into full, unrestrained laughter. It is not a chuckle of amusement, but a roar of contempt. 50,000 planes. The Americans? The idea is preposterous, a fantasy. Göring knows the cost, the complexity, the sheer industrial might required to build a modern air force. He had built the Luftwaffe himself from the ashes of the Treaty of Versailles. It had taken years. It required the funneling of a nation's entire resources. And this nation of car factories and cowboys thought it could simply will an air force into existence. An air force that at that very moment was smaller than that of Switzerland. He dismisses it with a wave of his hand. The Americans cannot even spell Messerschmitt, he scoffs, let alone build a plane that can challenge one. His laughter is a weapon of psychological warfare, aimed at an enemy an ocean away. It is the confidence of a man who believes he understands the rules of the game. In his Europe, war was a matter of existing stockpiles, of trained pilots, of factories that had been tooled for a decade. America had none of these. His arrogance was a fortress, and he saw no threat on the horizon large enough to breach its walls. But what Göring failed to see, what his laughter revealed he could not possibly comprehend, was that the rules had changed. He was thinking in terms of armies and stockpiles. Roosevelt was thinking in terms of assembly lines and raw potential. Göring saw a sleeping giant and mistook its silence for weakness. He did not hear the first groaning turn of an industrial engine about to roar to life. He did not see the dormant factories, the untapped resources, the innovative spirit that was about to be unleashed upon the world in a tidal wave of production. His mockery was a snapshot of a doomed philosophy. The echo of that laughter would hang over the war, a haunting reminder of the greatest miscalculation of the Third Reich. The pledge of 50,000 planes was not a ceiling, it was a floor. The real numbers would soon defy all German understanding, but in that moment the challenge was issued. The boast hung in the air, met only by the Reichsmarshal's derision. The world wondered, could a nation of peace really transform itself into a forge of war overnight? To understand the depth of Göring's mockery, we must step back from the smoke-filled rooms of Berlin and into the stark reality of American air power in 1939. The contrast could not have been more severe. While the Luftwaffe was a polished, battle-hardened instrument of terror, the United States Army Air Corps was a ghost of a fighting force. Imagine an airfield in the American heartland. The windswept tarmac is home to a handful of aircraft that look like relics from a past era. Biplanes with fixed landing gears and open cockpits, their fabric skins stretched taut over frail wooden frames. These were not the weapons of a world power. They were remnants of a bygone age. The total number of warplanes in the entire U.S. arsenal was less than 2,000, many of them obsolete trainers and observation planes. In comparison, the Luftwaffe boasted over 4,000 modern frontline aircraft, with production lines humming to build thousands more. This was not just a numerical disadvantage. It was a chasm of capability. The American military budget had been starved for decades, a reflection of the nation's deep-seated isolationism. Pilots trained with a fraction of the fuel needed for proficiency. Mechanics scrounged for spare parts. The Air Corps was a backwater, a small club of dedicated men flying outdated equipment, their ranks thinner than those of the Belgian Air Force. The idea of global air supremacy was a fantasy discussed in hushed tones, not a strategic goal. This was the foundation upon which Franklin D. Roosevelt built his audacious promise. To the world, and to many within America itself, the pledge to build 50,000 planes a year seemed not just ambitious, but delusional. It was as if a local militia had declared it would outproduce the entire German war machine. Military attachés from Europe filed reports dismissing American industrial potential. They saw a nation content with its automobiles and refrigerators, a people unprepared for the brutal demands of total war. The very concept of mass-producing complex machines like the B-17 Flying Fortress, with its countless precision parts, seemed to defy the laws of industrial physics. But Göring and the doubters were looking at the surface. They saw dormant factories and a peaceful populace. They did not see the blueprints being feverishly drafted in locked rooms in Detroit and Seattle. They did not hear the quiet conversations between industrial titans and military planners, conversations that had begun even before the bombs fell on Poland. The seeds of the impossible were already in the ground. Automobile executives were already studying aircraft designs, their minds calculating how to apply the principles of the assembly line to the construction of wings and fuselages. Tool and die shops, the unsung heroes of American manufacturing, were beginning the intricate process of retooling, of creating the jigs and fixtures that would transform sheets of aluminum into the skin of a warplane. It was a quiet, hidden mobilization happening in plain sight. The world saw a sleeping giant and laughed at its slumber. They did not recognize the subtle stirrings, the first deep breaths of an engine about to ignite. The declaration of 50,000 planes was a target thrown to the winds, a statement of intent that seemed to defy all observable reality. Yet behind the doubt, the seeds of an industrial miracle were already sprouting. The transformation began not on runways, but on factory floors. It was a revolution, measured in rivets and sweat, in the shriek of retooling machinery and the determined hum of a nation going to work. America's true strength was not in its existing military, but in the dormant potential of its industry. And in 1942, that potential was unleashed. The automobile industry, the crown jewel of American manufacturing, underwent a metamorphosis unlike anything the world had ever seen. General Motors, Chrysler, and Packard stopped making cars and started making tanks, engines, and aircraft components. But the ultimate symbol of this industrial awakening was taking shape on a stretch of farmland near Ypsilanti, Michigan. It was called Willow Run. Conceived by Henry Ford, the man who had perfected the moving assembly line, Willow Run was not merely a factory, it was a statement of intent. A mile long and a quarter-mile wide, it was a cathedral of production, a monument to scale and efficiency. The goal was as audacious as the building itself, to produce a B-24 Liberator heavy bomber, one of the most complex machines of its time, not in months, but in hours. Skeptics abounded. They called it Will It Run, doubting that automobile workers could master the intricate art of aircraft manufacturing. But they underestimated the American worker. The faces on the assembly line changed. With millions of men answering the call to arms, a new army marched into the factories, an army of women. Rosie the Riveter was not just a propaganda poster. She was a reality. Housewives, secretaries, and schoolteachers traded their domestic tools for rivet guns and welding torches. They wore turbans and overalls, their hands learning the rhythm of production, their precision ensuring that every wing, spar, and fuselage section met unforgiving tolerances. They were building not just airplanes, but a lifeline to the front. The process was a ballet of organized chaos. Raw aluminum sheets arrived at one end of Willow Run. As they moved down the line, they were cut, stamped, curved, and riveted. Wings took shape, bodies were formed, and engines were mounted. The sound was deafening, a symphony of industry composed of pneumatic hisses, the relentless thud of presses, and the clatter of metal on metal. From a distance it looked like chaos, but it was a chaos meticulously planned, each worker a vital note in a symphony of production. And then the miracle happened. A completed B-24, a giant of aluminum and steel, rolled out of the plant's massive doors. Then another, and another. The Will It Run. Doubters were silenced as Willow Run began to hit its stride, eventually producing a bomber an hour. This was the arsenal of democracy in action. It was no longer a political slogan. It was the tangible reality of American ingenuity and labor, a direct rebuttal to Göring's laughter. The skies over America began to fill with new shapes, not just from Willow Run, but from converted shipyards in California, from retooled locomotive works in Pennsylvania. The numbers started to climb, first in the hundreds, then in the thousands. The impossible promise was becoming a monthly production report. Still, building machines was one thing, but could America find the people to fly them? The machines were rolling off the lines in staggering numbers, but an airplane without a pilot is merely a sculpture. A nation needed an army of aviators. And so, as the factories hummed, America launched a second, equally audacious mobilization, the training of its people. The call went out, and the response was a tidal wave of youth and ambition. Farm boys from the Midwest who had never traveled beyond their county line. College students who traded textbooks for flight manuals. Mechanics and engineers who felt the pull of a higher purpose. They descended upon places like Randolph Field in Texas, the west point of the Ortain, and a network of over 500 new training airfields that dotted the country like a constellation of ambition. The training was relentless, a brutal weeding out process under the relentless sun. They started in fragile PT-17 Stearmans, their stomachs lurching as they learned the fundamentals of flight. They were taught not just to fly, but to fight, to navigate by the stars, to dogfight in the dizzying expanse of the sky, to bring a damaged bird home. The attrition rate was high. Not everyone had the touch, the nerve, the instinct. But those who did emerged as a new breed of warrior, forged in the crucible of American airspace. But this new army was not composed solely of men. As the demand for pilots outstripped the supply of available men, a corps of remarkable women stepped forward. They were the Women Air Force Service Pilots, the WASPs. Under the leadership of pioneers like Jacqueline Cochran, these women were not just volunteers. They were elite pilots, often with more flying hours than the male cadets they trained alongside. Their mission was critical, though often unheralded. They ferried every type of military aircraft from the factories to the embarkation points, flying unfamiliar, sometimes faulty planes across the vast continent. They towed targets for live anti-aircraft artillery practice, the tracers flashing perilously close to their cockpits. They tested newly repaired engines, putting their lives on the line to ensure the machines were safe for the combat pilots who would follow. They freed up thousands of male pilots for overseas duty, becoming the indispensable backbone of the domestic air transport system. They faced skepticism, even hostility, but they flew with a skill and determination that silenced their doubters. On the ground, another army was forming. Mechanics, radiomen, armorers, and ground crews trained with the same intensity as the pilots. They learned to service a screaming Rolls-Royce Merlin engine in the pitch black of a foggy English night, to rearm a P-51 650 caliber machine guns in minutes, to patch a flak hole in a B-17's fuselage with sheet metal and sheer will. The airplane was a weapon, but it was the ground crew that kept it sharp. By March 1945, this vast and intricate machine was in full, world-altering motion. The promise had been fulfilled and then shattered. America was not building 50,000 planes a year. It was building nearly 100,000. The skies were no longer silent. They were filled with the drone of training aircraft and the thunderous roar of bombers being delivered to war. And soon, these planes and pilots would face their first great test in skies already dominated by the Luftwaffe. The first American bombers appeared over occupied Europe in 1942, a stark silver promise against the bleak sky. They were the vanguard of the arsenal of democracy, the flying fortresses. But a factory floor in Michigan was a world away from the flak-filled skies of Germany. The theory of strategic bombing was about to meet the brutal, unforgiving reality of the Luftwaffe. The early missions were a blooding. Young crews, their training measured in months, not years, flew into a hornet's nest of experienced German fighter pilots who had been fighting since the Battle of Britain. The doctrine was simple and fatally flawed. The B-17s would fly in tight defensive boxes, their 50 caliber machine guns providing mutual protection. They would fly deep into enemy territory without fighter escorts, because the high command believed no fighter had the range to accompany them. It was a belief paid for in blood. The Luftwaffe's tactics were mercilessly effective. German fighters, the sleek Focke-Wulf FW-190s and agile Messerschmitt Bf-109s, would line up for head-on passes, cannons blazing, tearing into the vulnerable noses of the bombers. They would attack from above, out of the sun, their pilots' eyes sharpened by years of combat. The sky became a chaos of exploding metal, of tracers arcing, of bombers shuddering under impacts before spiraling down, trailing black smoke and dreams. The losses were catastrophic. On a single raid to the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt in October 1943, 60 B-17s were shot down out of a force of 291. That's over 600 men lost in a single day. The airfields in England would wait for the returning armada, counting the gaps in the formations. The silence after a mission was often more deafening than the engine's roar before it. Empty bunks in the Nissen huts told the story more eloquently than any after-action report. Göring's laughter, it seemed, had been prophetic, but within this crucible of fire, a new American Air Force was being forged. The lessons were learned with terrible speed. The tight box formation was refined into an even more disciplined, interlocking wall of fire. Crews learned to dodge flak, to hold formation even as their friends' planes disintegrated beside them. They developed a cold, professional courage that became their shield. Most importantly, the failure of the unescorted bomber doctrine sparked a revolution. The demand for a long-range fighter became a scream. The answer was already in the pipeline, the P-51 Mustang. When paired with a British-designed drop tank, this graceful, deadly machine could fly all the way to Berlin and back. It was the game-changer. Now the bombers would not be lambs to the slaughter. They would be the anvil, and the Mustangs would be the hammer. The early dark days had seared a truth into the soul of the 8th Air Force. Production alone could not win the air war. It required adaptation, tactical genius, and the grim acceptance of sacrifice. The naive confidence of 1942 had been replaced by the hardened resolve of 1944. With every loss, America grew stronger, and the tide was beginning to turn. The American response to the early bloodletting was not just to build more of the same. It was to innovate, to leapfrog the enemy with technology that redefined the very physics of air combat. The war was forcing an evolution, and two aircraft came to symbolize this dramatic surge: the fighter that conquered Europe and the bomber that would reach for Japan. The P-51 Mustang began its life as a British request, a design penned in a blistering 100 days by North American aviation. But its initial engine left it languishing as a mediocre low-altitude performer. The transformation was sparked by a simple, brilliant idea: replace the American Allison engine with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin. The result was not an improvement. It was a revelation. The P-51B, with its elegant laminar flow wings and the supercharged Merlin, could fly higher, faster, and farther than any other fighter in the world, but its true genius was in its range. With the addition of streamlined drop tanks, the Mustang could fly over 1,600 miles, all the way to the heart of the Third Reich and back. This was the answer to the Luftwaffe's predatory tactics. No longer could German pilots maul the bomber formations and then disengage to refuel. Now the hunters became the hunted. Mustang pilots, flying sleek red-tailed escorts for the B-17s, were ordered to be aggressive. They were to seek out and destroy the Luftwaffe wherever it could be found. The skies over Germany became a killing ground, and the P-51 was the undisputed master. It was more than a plane. It was a strategic weapon that neutralized Göring's greatest asset. If the P-51 was a scalpel, the B-29 Superfortress was a sledgehammer forged in the future. It was a project of such complexity and scale, it made the B-17 look primitive. Pressurized cabins allowed crews to fly in shirt sleeves at 30,000 feet, high above the worst of the flak. A centralized computer-controlled fire system allowed a handful of gunners to operate 5 remote-controlled turrets, engaging enemy fighters with terrifying accuracy. Its wings, vast and graceful, could carry 20,000 pounds of bombs over 3,000 miles. The B-29 was not just an aircraft. It was a flying battleship, a product of an industrial and scientific base that no Axis power could hope to match. It was built for a specific, brutal purpose: to bring the war to the Japanese homeland. By the dawn of 1945, the technological gap was no longer a gap. It was a chasm. American factories were not just producing quantity. They were delivering qualitative supremacy. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was being systematically bled white by a fighter it could not escape, while a new kind of bomber was appearing in the Pacific skies, against which Japan had no effective defense. But could sheer numbers and innovation break the Luftwaffe's iron grip on the skies? By 1944, the character of the sky over Europe had changed. The occasional costly raids of 1942 were a distant memory. Now the very air began to vibrate with a new, terrifying frequency. It started as a low, distant hum, a sound that made farmers in the fields of France and schoolchildren in German cities look up. The hum deepened into a rumble, and the rumble grew into a continuous, earth-shaking roar that could last for an hour or more. It was the sound of the impossible made manifest. It was the sound of the American air armada. The numbers were stupefying. On a single morning, 1,000 bombers or more would lift from airfields across England, their contrails painting vast, converging highways in the sky. They assembled into vast, staggered combat boxes, a city of aluminum and steel, moving at 200 miles per hour. Below, the citizens of the Reich looked up at a new kind of eclipse, not of the sun, but of their leader's promise of invincibility. The impossible 50,000 planes a year were not just a production statistic. They were an environmental fact, a force of nature unleashed upon Fortress Europe. For Hermann Göring, the distant hum was the echo of his own mockery turning back upon him. The hunter, who had once scoffed at the very idea of a challenge, was now watching his domain be systematically dismantled. The Luftwaffe was being bled white. His veteran pilots, his irreplaceable aces, were being shot down in droves by the relentless swarms of P-51 Mustangs. New green pilots were rushed to the front with only a fraction of the training, their life expectancy measured in sorties. The once proud German aircraft industry, hidden in forests and underground factories, was itself now the primary target of the very bombers it had failed to stop. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. The myth of the Luftwaffe's invincibility, a cornerstone of Nazi propaganda, crumbled with every air raid siren. The Reichsmarschall, who had once promised that no enemy bomb would ever fall on German soil, became a figure of ridicule and scorn among his own people. He retreated into isolation, his influence waning as his creation failed him. The laughter in the smoky room had been replaced by the grim silence of defeat. The American strategy was one of overwhelming industrial-scale warfare. It was not about finesse. It was about weight. The constant grinding pressure of the round-the-clock bombing, the Americans by day, the British by night, shattered German industry, shattered transportation networks, and shattered morale. The skies, which Göring had claimed as his own, now belonged to the swarm, and the final blow was yet to come, in a war that spanned continents, while the skies over Germany thundered with the weight of 1,000 bombers. An entirely different air war was raging across the vast expanse of the Pacific. Here the runways were not the grassy fields of England, but the rolling decks of aircraft carriers and hastily carved strips of coral and sand. The challenge was not flak-and fighters over cities, but limitless ocean, typhoons, and a fanatical enemy. Yet the same industrial engine that was overwhelming. The Luftwaffe was now powering a dual-front offensive on a scale Göring's. Germany could never have conceived the weapon was the same, American. Air power, but its application was utterly different. In Europe it was a sledgehammer. In the Pacific it was a scalpel and a shield. The aircraft carrier task force became the new capital ship, a mobile, unsinkable airfield that could project power thousands of miles from any friendly shore. The roar of F-6F Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs clearing the decks signaled the arrival of American mitered islands whose names were previously unknown to the world. These rugged fighters, born from the lessons of early clashes with the nimble Japanese Zero, were now superior in almost every way, dominating the air and clearing the path for the bombers. And the bombers came. The B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced and expensive weapon of the war, was built for this theater. Its long range allowed it to strike the Japanese home islands from newly captured bases in the Mariana Islands, like Tinian and Saipan. The strategy of island hopping was, at its core, a strategy of airfield hopping. Each bloody conquest was not just about territory. It was about moving the air power closer, tightening the noose. The firebombing raids on Tokyo in March 1945 created firestorms that dwarfed the destruction of any single raid in Europe, a horrifying demonstration of the destructive capacity that American industry had unleashed. This was the ultimate testament to the arsenal of democracy. Germany and Japan, for all their tactical brilliance and ferocious fighting spirit, were fighting a war of finite resources. They were draining their reserves. America was fighting a war of infinite production. It was not a question of choosing between a new squadron for Europe or a new carrier group for the Pacific. The answer was always both. The same factories that produced P-51s for the 8th Air Force were also producing F-4Us for the Marines. The same training pipelines that created B-17 pilots were creating Avenger torpedo bomber crews. Göring had laughed at the idea of 50,000 planes, a number he believed was logistically and industrially fantastical. He could not have comprehended a reality where America would not only meet that number, but would also have the capacity to deploy and sustain two separate, massive air forces on opposite sides of the globe, each facing a different elite enemy air force, and decisively defeat them both. And as America's engines roared, the Luftwaffe fell silent. By the bitter winter of 1944-45, the Luftwaffe was a ghost of its former self. The mighty armada that had spearheaded the Blitzkrieg was now shattered, its backbone broken not by a single decisive battle, but by the relentless, grinding pressure of an enemy it could not comprehend. The signs of collapse were everywhere, and they were terminal. The most crippling blow was one Göring had never anticipated: the starvation of his force. Allied bombers had systematically pummeled synthetic fuel plants, refineries, and transportation networks. The result was an air force grounded for lack of gasoline. Elite pilots, aces with over 100 kills, sat on airfields, their advanced Me-262 jet fighters silent and useless. Training flights were cancelled. Sorties were rationed. The skies, once their exclusive domain, were now ceded to the enemy by default. The Luftwaffe was being defeated not in the air, but on the ground. When German fighters did manage to scramble, they were swarmed. The numerical superiority was absurd. A handful of FW-190s would rise to challenge a stream of 1,000 bombers, only to be set upon by 3 times their number in P-51 Mustangs. The experienced pilot corps, the heart of the Luftwaffe, had been bled dry over 3 years of relentless combat. They were replaced by boys, rushed through a truncated training program, sent aloft with just enough skill to take off, but not enough to survive. They were not pilots. They were sacrifices. The February 1945 Operation Frühlingswind, a desperate last-gasp mass attack, was cut to pieces before it even reached the bomber streams. It was the death rattle of a once proud force. The psychological collapse mirrored the physical one. Hermann Göring, the flamboyant Reichsmarshal, became a recluse, his authority stripped away by a furious Hitler. The man who had promised that no enemy bomb would fall on German soil now presided over cities reduced to rubble. His laughter at Roosevelt's pledge was now a bitter, haunting irony. He had mocked the ambition of a nation of shopkeepers and mechanics. Now that nation's machines darkened the sky above his own country, and his own sophisticated air force had ceased to exist. The very concept of outproducing an enemy was a form of warfare that the Nazi war economy, built on plunder and limited resources, was inherently unable to wage or withstand. The final, symbolic end came in the spring of 1945. As American tanks rumbled into Germany, they overran abandoned Luftwaffe airfields. They found rows of aircraft, some of them technologically brilliant, like the Me-262, sitting uselessly, their fuel tanks dry, their pilots gone. The wreckage of Göring's dream was not just in the burned-out fuselages littering the countryside. It was in the profound silence that had fallen over the Reich. The scream of the Stuka was a memory. The air war was over. So what legacy did this industrial miracle leave behind? The final tally was not just a number. It was a monument. The promise that had been met with such derision was not merely fulfilled, it was obliterated. America did not build 50,000 planes in a year. At the peak of the production frenzy in 1944, the nation's factories were churning out aircraft at a rate that would see nearly 100,000 built before the year was out. The impossible had been achieved, then doubled. This was not just an industrial achievement. It was a historical pivot point, a demonstration of a new kind of power that would define the rest of the century and beyond. The legacy of this surge reshaped the world. It proved irrevocably that the outcome of modern conflict is decided as much in the factories and shipyards as on the battlefields. The war was won by the courage of the soldier, the sailor, and the airman, but it was enabled by the welder, the riveter, and the engineer. This lesson was not lost on the post-war world. The Cold War that followed would be, from its very beginning, an industrial and technological competition, a standoff between competing systems of production. The ability to project power globally through air bases and carrier groups, a cornerstone of American foreign policy, was born directly from the lessons learned in those frantic war years. The achievement was a permanent rebuttal to the tyranny of doubt. It proved that a free society, a democracy, could mobilize its people and its economy with a speed and efficiency that dictatorships, for all their centralized control, could not match. It was not about forced labor or top-down commands. It was about unleashing potential, about a collective will harnessed to a common cause. The victory was one of innovation, adaptability, and the raw power of a mobilized citizenry. The image of Hermann Göring, once the epitome of martial arrogance, faded into history as a cautionary tale of hubris. His laughter, which had once echoed in the halls of power, was silenced by a sound that grew ever louder, the roar of Pratt & Whitney engines over Berlin, the scream of Rolls-Royce Merlins diving on fleeing Messerschmitts, the thunderous approach of B-29s over Tokyo. The joke, in the end, was on him. He had bet on the limits of democracy and had lost everything. The echo of those American engines never truly faded. It is heard in the global air routes, patrolled by aircraft built on the same principles of mass production, in the deterrence provided by modern air forces, and in the enduring truth that preparedness and the will to innovate are the greatest defenses against aggression. The story is not one of triumphalism, but of a profound lesson in resilience. It is a testament to the hidden strength that lies dormant within nations and people, a strength that, when awakened, can achieve what the cynics and the tyrants dismiss as fantasy. Closing reflection. In the end, the joke was on Göring, and the laughter of freedom was louder than his scoffs. It was the sound of an idea, that ordinary people, united by a common purpose, could accomplish the extraordinary. It is a sound that still defines our world, a reminder that the greatest force on earth is not the arrogance of power, but the power of a dream, forged in steel and built on an assembly line.